Well, it may be a relatively short lap, and many of the corners may be line locked, thus preventing the short corner drivers out there from doing anything special. But one thing Zandvoort does usually throw at us, and it was no exception in 2024, changeable conditions. It's not only the onshore winds from the channel, it's also the dust and the sand thrown up by the winds. Lots of gusts, lots of crosswinds, lots of variables with which to play at Zandvoort, particularly as we went into FP3 and the track was wet. Very little to be gained in FP3 because shortly afterwards Logan Sargent dropped the lot coming out of on the fast section of road between turn 1 and effectively turn 2. Got onto a bit of curb, got onto a bit of grass, the finesse wasn't quite there to hold it, and he just spun across the track to the outside, hit the guardrail hard. The car actually caught fire, the Williams-Mercedes actually caught fire at the back. Quite a big drama that, and that basically, I've got to say, I'm very pleased that Logan was unhurt in all of that. But basically that meant that the session was over. There was one weird 2-minute cameo right at the end, everybody rushing out on intermediates. Difficult to see why, because really the only reason was to go out to get onto the grid and do some practice starts in case the conditions are going to be like that on Sunday. And we had some weird things going on with Max Verstappen passing Lando Norris coming out of the pit lane, sort of playing with fire as he put wheels on the white line on the exit from the pit lane. No word from the stewards about that. Lots of replays on the TV. I suppose lots of people thinking there was going to be a penalty, but no mention of that as I speak. But rather strange rush of blood from Max. I guess it just shows the frustration he was in, along with many of the other drivers, but particularly Max on home soil in front of his fans, that not much progress was being made. Anyway, we then went into qualifying, which was in the dry. There was some clouds and there was some rain kind of in the air, but none of it actually fell to affect practice. Everybody ran the soft, slick Pirelli tyre in all 3 sessions of qualifying. Well, those that made it through to Q2 and Q3, of course. So with no more ado then, let's have a look at the qualifying results. I've got the key players there from which the race, I'm sure, will be decided tomorrow, bearing in mind it's a really short lap. And strategy, of course, will also play a big role, as will politics within the team, intra-team politics. Lando Norris it was, who right at the end, Max just having taken the pole with that 10-0, the crowd going wild, but Lando was about 200, 300 metres behind him on the road, as he was yesterday actually in FP1. And Lando it was who got the pole, not by 100th, not by 1,000th, but by a huge margin, by 0.4, a massive margin for a circuit lap that short and for a field that competitive, 9.6 for Lando Norris. You can see that I've got next to it the speed through the trap, the fastest speed they did through the trap. Actually, when Lando was on that quickest lap, he did 3.29, 3.3 though, or thereabouts. It's pretty similar. The only one that really stands out there is how quick George Russell and Sergio Perez were through the trap, and that's probably because they were running a little bit less relative front flap compared with the 2 McLarens and Max. And then I've got the sector times, how they compared on that final run. And then finally, the sets of tyres that were used. I've got that in because a little bit of bragging rights. I managed to do it with only using 4 sets. You can see that, for example, George Russell and Sergio Perez used 5. Sergio Perez used 5 because he got quite badly balked by Lewis Hamilton. He actually used up a set without doing a time when he says he was balked by Lewis Hamilton. Again, that matter under the attention of the stewards as I speak. Fernando Alonso, another, using 5 sets to do that time, and afterwards breathlessly saying that's about as quick as I can go. Bragging rights, but also, of course, going into the race tomorrow, it's always nice to have more sets of soft tyres than your Oppo, if that's possible. And a shout out to Alex Albon, who qualified a very good 8th, and to Pierre Gasly, who was 10th in the Alpine Renault, both of whom also only used 4 sets of tyres, compared with, say, Lance Stroll, who was 9th, who used the 5 sets like Fernando. So thinking about that lap of Lando's, the word that springs to mind is elegant. Just beautiful, smooth, rhythmic driving with no sharp edges, no glitches, but lovely drifts, not afraid coming out of corners, particularly just basically 4-wheel drifts coming out of some of the slower corners. Just beautiful to watch from Lando. I've said from day one how good he is in that respect, how soft his touch is, his steering, his throttle. I've always said his only shortcoming is that he isn't quite inclined to use short corners as the way Max, or create short corners as Max, Lewis and Charles does, and as Oscar has been trying to do. But he's always balanced that with this amazing feel and touch. And as I said yesterday, Zandvoort, to my mind, isn't a circuit where a driver who can create short corners, who can extend the straight going in and extend the straight coming out with perfect judgment of the rotation point, this isn't a circuit that lends itself to that sort of bolt-on skill, if you like, because the corners are in the main landlocked, and we've got bank corners as well. But it was interesting nonetheless to see how quick Lando was, not only on the lap, but how quick he was through Sector 1, which begins at the start-finish line. Obviously, the speed trap is just before the braking area, so it's a pretty meaningful speed trap in terms of it being terminal velocity. But Sector 1 obviously begins at the start-finish line, but then finishes just after turn 6, which is at the top of the hill. You've already had 2 or 3 very fast sweepers there, flat out in 7th gear. So basically it's turn 1, Tarzan hairpin as we used to know it. It's acceleration out of there, then it's going through turn 2, which is a very fast right kink, then braking hard into 3, which is the banked Hunza Rug corner behind the pits, very, very steeply banked, and then accelerating out of there and benefiting from anything you may do through that banked Hunza Rug on that long run, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. And as you can see from the data there, he's basically 0.2 quicker than anybody else through that section. Really interesting thing, looking at the data in very fine detail, but to sum it up, is that Oscar brakes harder and later into turn 1, which means that he's actually getting into the lower gears sooner. So when Lando's in 4th, Oscar's already grabbing 3rd, but going a little bit quicker at the time. So that higher top speed and that hard braking, he's really going through the gears to get the car stopped, whereas Lando's doing everything in a lot more, what's the right word, elegant way, going into the corner there. And then they go through Tarzan, but the biggest difference of all is on the acceleration run out of Tarzan and how they go through those slight kinks towards turn 2. And Lando there is absolutely brilliant, because there's a moment there when they're both in 5th gear, but Lando is going through with no brakes and no throttle. The car's obviously right on the edge, and he's just letting it float through the corner. I've mentioned this before. He did that a lot at Silverstone in the wet. Whereas Oscar, at that precise moment, is braking and has already reduced the speed. He's going something like 4 kilometers an hour slower than Lando through there. And it's not a question of braking late. It's a question almost of balancing the car and how they're doing that. Oscar's probably giving it a bit of left foot brake, whereas he's not giving it against throttle, but he's giving it a bit of left foot brake, possibly just to get the back end sorted. Whereas Lando's just doing it by touching nothing and letting the car settle. And that is the beauty of Lando Norris. That is where he's found this time around Zandvoort relative to his teammate. Of course, you can't really compare him to any other driver in any other car because all the cars are different. But that is the moment. That was the moment of the lap where Lando had it over Oscar. And Oscar was very good everywhere else. You can see from the sector times there, 24.8, 24.8 for both the McLaren drivers. Actually, Max quickest in Sector 2. And then 1/10 slower in Sector 3. That might be a slight glitch that he had coming out of that slow corner before the last run up into the final bank corner. But that wasn't how he lost the pole. In my opinion, he lost the pole in Sector 1. We didn't lose the pole. Lando won the pole in Sector 1 in that beautiful piece of driving between turns 1 and turn 3, that bank corner. And that section of road is not often talked about. It's I remember having a chat to Dan Gurney once, and I made the mistake of saying to Dan, we don't often see a lot of pictures of you with massive opposite lock on the car. Talking about his Formula One career. And he said, I'm not sure that's right, Peter. And then sort of 3 weeks later, I get a picture a photo in the post signed by Dan saying something like, told you, with an exclamation mark. And so actually he's in the Brabham and he's at the Nürburgring. The whole thing is completely sideways. But it does remind me of a shot of Dan in the Eagle that I've seen going through that section between turns 1 and Hans Rug when he's going through that right-hander and the car is just in the most beautiful opposite lock drift. Now, sadly, we don't get opposite lock drifts today, although I have said that Lando has this ability to let the car sort of float, and it looks like it's just a perfect four-wheel drift because you don't actually see any correction. The car's just moving, all four wheels just moving beautifully in harmony. I say in harmony, not disconnected front axle to rear axle, if you see what I mean. And I think it was that section of road, and I didn't mention that when we were previewing the Grand Prix of how good that was. And it's actually better than the bit I did mention, which is right at the top of the hill, that very fast right-hander. It's very dramatic, but it's kind of landlocked and it's very downforcey. Whereas that bit after turn 1 is just a beautiful bit of road. I'm sure Logan Sargent doesn't agree with me, but that's where Lando got it. And that's all fingertip. That's absolutely beautiful. And interesting to see that Max is also braking, as is Oscar Piastri, at exactly that piece where Lando has just got nothing going on, throttle and brakes. But difficult, as I say, to compare a McLaren with a Red Bull because they're two different cars, different power units and everything else. So yeah, that's where I say chapeau to Lando Norris, because that was a beautiful piece of driving, and that's where he got it. And obviously he kept everything on the island and very calm after that. Because it's one thing to do that in Sector 1. It's quite another to keep the lap together for Sectors 2 and 3, because obviously the adrenaline's up. I guess the adrenaline's up in the case of Lando. He's a pretty laid-back guy, isn't he? And he kept it all together. Beautiful lap. I absolutely astonished. I astonishingly quick. I suspect the jaws dropped at Red Bull when he did that time, because that 4/10 around Zandvoort is a massive amount. So yeah, absolutely brilliant. Max's lap, as you can see there, I mean, it's all unbelievably close. And the really significant thing about Max's lap is that he lost most of his time relative to Lando in Sector 1 on the exit from Hansaruck, on the exit from that banked turn 3 through those flat out 7th gear sweepers. He was 2 kilometers slower through one trap, 2.5 kilometers slower through a next. And as they got to the top of the hill at the end of Sector 1, he was still 1 or 2 kilometers down on Lando there. And that comes under the heading of medium to high speed change of direction. So that's another area where McLaren obviously are really, really good now. The Red Bull was slightly slower than the McLarens through the trap, not towards the end. I mean, it kind of depended on wind and crosswind and everything else, but they were running a lot of downforce relative to, say, Perez's car, which had, I think, less front flap, and Perez is quicker through the trap than Max as a result. And in theory, Max was then going to gain through Sectors 1 and Sectors 2, where there's downforce is quite important. But look at that, 24/7. Yeah, he did a great job in Sector 2. Really good job, and I think he utilised the downforce really well there. But Sector 1, that's where it got away from him. 2/10 again to Lando. And that isn't a downforcey thing there. That's just the ability of the driver to feel the surface of the road. And obviously right now, whether it's the way the tyres are working, whether it's tyre temperatures, whether it's whatever it is, the cambers they may be running or maybe not, it's McLaren that are giving that feel to Lando Norris right now. And I do the comparison with Oscar Piastri, because there have been moments, and there possibly still will be moments in the future, when Oscar has looked like the next big mega superstar of Formula One, an Ayrton Senna quality driver, some are saying. But here, if he is the next Ayrton Senna, please advise, because look at what Lando's doing to him compared with his lap. I mean, that is just amazing, isn't it? So I think there were two really significant things in qualifying. One is that Lando outqualified Oscar Piastri to that extent. Absolutely brilliant. And secondly, that Max made it on the front row ahead of Oscar Piastri. And I think that was a really good lap in what you could probably say isn't as good a car as the McLaren right now. But how that will pan out in terms of the championship, of course, remains to be seen. George Russell in Q1, just to show how knife edgy the Mercedes is, had no grip at all on his first run. Then they got things sorted in terms of how he went out, how he brought the front tyres in, how he got the rears to work. And poor old Lewis Hamilton, who looked pretty good throughout. He's looked pretty good in the morning session. He looked good in the wet. He's looked good every time he's been in the car. Just when it came down to qualifying, really came down to the crunch in Q2, he couldn't get a lap. And I think that's part of the knife edgy thing of Mercedes, getting the tyres to work, getting the right out lap with lots of traffic, everybody trying to do the same thing at the same time. And partly because, as I said earlier, Zandvoort isn't a circuit where a driver of the quality of Lewis... Sorry, I shouldn't say the quality, because that demeans George Russell. What I mean is the driver that loves to create short corners, if he has feel and balance, one of them is Lewis Hamilton, always has been. And he can't really do very much around Zandvoort. Even if the car was really good, there's not much a driver like Lewis can do to a Mercedes that George Russell can't do. So that was always going to be relatively difficult for him in that respect, just trying to find somewhere that would work for him. And then beyond that, all the knife edgy things. And it just shows that Mercedes are on a much finer edge than McLaren, who've got a much bigger sweet spot right now. Although when Mercedes do have the sweet spot, they're not very far away. And that is the problem. And it's all very well for Mercedes to say, oh, we'll go away and think about it some more. I mean, that's always been the situation at Mercedes. It's just that their peaks are getting a little bit higher and a little bit nearer to Red Bull, even alongside Red Bull on occasions, as we've seen already, Silverstone being a good example. But in terms of sustaining that level of performance, McLaren still way ahead of them in terms of their sweet spot. So that's really what happened to Lewis. He just got swallowed by the bunch and didn't get out of Q2. George had one bad run, but then did a very good job. But as I say, he had to use 5 sets of tyres to do that. Sergio Perez also used 5 sets, but one of them, I say, was written off by that incident with Lewis, so they had to bring him in and use another new set to get him in there. But he did a good job. P5, after where he's been on a circuit that's this competitive with lap times this close, relatively short lap. He did a very good job, I think, and looked to be a refreshed driver. I mean, looked to be like the old Sergio Perez, not rushing the car into the corner quite as much, but really, really good on exits. And that's, I think, where he found a lot of his time over drivers like Charles Leclerc, who I think were a little bit over the top. The Ferrari wasn't great. Carlos Sainz was fabulous in terms of not having done any running at all. He barely ran yesterday, barely ran this morning. They threw soft tyres at it in Q1 and he started relatively slowly, but within about 5 laps he was up there ahead of Charles. But then again, he had other issues. Yeah, just terrible the weekend for Carlos Sainz so far. Bear in mind the pressure he's under anyway. I say pressure, everyone says, oh, well, he's got his Williams deal now. And I'm thinking, yeah, right, he's got his Williams deal. He's still under pressure because he needs to get a proper drive, doesn't he? That's not disrespecting Williams, but we want to see Carlos Sainz in a Merc or a Red Bull well, I do anyway, or back at Ferrari even. So a lot of pressure on him, and he did a good job, but didn't get, like Lewis, really, didn't get through into Q3. Because it's that sort of circuit. And then Fernando Alonso rung the best from the Aston Martin, just sort of went out one quick lap on 5 sets of tyres. And obviously we have to make the point that for Sergio Perez and Fernando Alonso, they didn't go out for the first runs in Q3, so the pressure's on them to do those runs, and very good lap from both of them in that respect. Well, Fernando did his first and then sort of did nothing, whereas Sergio Perez went out, sat out the first phase and went out in the second phase. So that was qualifying. As we've said all along, and I'm sure everybody else is saying, very, very close, likely to be a very, very tight race. With Max on the front row now, that opens up all sorts of bizarre things, which is, can Lando Norris finally parlay a decent pole position into the lead of the race coming out of turn 1? The pressure's on Lando now to do the start, which I'm sure he'll be thinking about, or not thinking about, depends on how well he wants to sleep tonight. And Max is there on the inside, on the dirty side of the grid admittedly, but on the inside going down into that tight right-hander. Lots of room on the outside there, so it's going to be a knife-edgy first corner, I think. And Oscar Piastri sort of will be dodging around behind them, waiting to see where the gap is. Making sure, I guess, that he doesn't do anything to annoy Lando, but equally, the gloves are off there between the two McLaren drivers, I think. I don't mean that in an aggressive way. I just mean that in a way that, let them race sort of way, the Zach Brown sort of way. But as I've been saying, as I said from Hungary, McLaren, as the season gets tighter, will rue those points that Lando threw away in the Hungarian Grand Prix. George Russell should have won the British Grand Prix, should have won the Belgian Grand Prix. He'll be thinking, well, I'm there or thereabouts, sort of race where there could be quite a lot of safety cars, could be quite a lot of stuff coming into play. George Russell's sort of day, let's see if we can get a result out of this. And Sergio Perez needs to get a podium finish, doesn't he? I haven't talked about Max, really. Can Max actually win this race? I don't think he can if it's a straight fight between him and Lando. But as I say, if he gets the lead, it could be different, because then it kind of depends what's happening for second place and whether Oscar Piastri is harassing Lando or not, or whether maybe Piastri's gone in front of Lando. Lots of things there. If Max doesn't get in front of Lando into turn 1, I think it's going to be a bit difficult day for him, because I can't see, based on the evidence of yesterday, how good the McLaren was out of the box at Zandvoort and how good it was today, and what great use Lando made of that. It's going to be difficult for Max to win that race tomorrow, but he won't be thinking that. He'll be thinking front row, Dutch Grand Prix, my Grand Prix. We'll see what happens tomorrow. A million variables out there. Bring it on, I guess, is what he'll be thinking. And of course, I'll be looking forward to that very much as well. So see you tomorrow. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja. And a big thanks to you, of course, the viewer. See you then.